This is a $20 bill. In Colombia, it buys you roughly 80,000 pesos at today's exchange rate. That sounds like a lot until you realize what that $20 actually represents in the shadow economy. In the cocaine trade, this same bill moves through 7 different hands before it ever touches a legitimate bank. Each transfer adds a fee. Each fee creates a record. And each record is a liability that Colombian President Gustavo Petro just declared war on. On January 15, 2026, Petro's administration quietly filed regulatory amendments with the Superintendencia Financiera de Colombia, the country's banking regulator, that would effectively create a parallel currency system for what they're calling agricultural commodity settlements. The document is 847 pages. The international press covered exactly none of it, but buried on page 612 is a provision that allows for non-dollar denominated settlement of export commodities through bilateral sovereign agreements. This is not about farming. This is about $14 billion in annual cocaine exports finding a way to bypass the US dollar system entirely. And when that happens, every bank in South America holding dollar reserves becomes a liability instead of an asset. Here's what they're not telling you. Colombia produces approximately 1,400 metric tons of cocaine annually. That's according to the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime's 2025 report, a figure that's grown 23% since Petro took office in August 2022. The street value of this production sits somewhere between $75 billion and $120 billion, depending on final destination markets. But here's the number that matters. Only $14 billion of that value stays in Colombia. The rest evaporates through the dollar-based money laundering system that takes a 70 to 80% cut just to make dirty money clean. Petro's calculation is brutally simple. If Colombia could capture even half of that lost value, $30 to $40 billion annually, the country's GDP would surge by 12% overnight. The question was never whether to do it. The question was how to do it without the United States parking an aircraft carrier off Cartagena. The answer arrived in November 2025, when China's State Administration of Foreign Exchange signed a memorandum of understanding with Banco de la República, Colombia's central bank. The memorandum authorized a 50 billion yuan currency swap facility, roughly $7 billion, ostensibly for trade facilitation. But the mechanism created something far more significant: a dollar-free settlement channel between Colombia and the world's largest consumer market. At 4:15 a.m. Bogota time on December 3rd, the first test transaction cleared. A shipment of processed agricultural botanicals valued at 180 million yuan moved from a Cali-based export firm to a Shanghai trading company. No dollars touched the transaction. No SWIFT messages were generated. No U.S.-regulated correspondent bank saw the flow. The official commodity code listed the shipment as Category 1211.90.80, plants and parts of plants used primarily in perfumery, in pharmacy, or for insecticidal, fungicidal, or similar purposes. This is the same harmonized system code that legitimate coca leaf exporters have used for decades to ship raw material to pharmaceutical companies. The difference is scale. Legitimate coca exports to pharmaceutical firms total approximately $2 million annually. This single test transaction was worth $25 million. This is where the lie becomes unsustainable. The global financial system processes approximately $5 trillion in daily foreign exchange transactions. Of that, 88% involves the US dollar on at least one side of the trade. This isn't because the dollar is inherently superior. It's because the settlement infrastructure, the pipes through which money flows, was built by American institutions, under American rules, with American oversight. When Colombia moves cocaine revenue through traditional channels, the money must convert to dollars, pass through a U.S.-regulated correspondent bank, and leave a trail that Treasury Department algorithms can track. This is why the DEA's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network catches roughly $2 billion in suspicious Colombia-linked transactions annually, and why $75 billion still makes it through. The system is porous, but it's American porosity. Washington gets to decide which leaks to plug and which to ignore. Petro's parallel currency system changes this equation entirely. By settling in yuan, rubles, or a proposed BRICS basket currency, Colombian exports can bypass the dollar infrastructure completely. The money never touches Chase, never routes through Citibank, never generates a Fedwire message. It moves from Banco de Bogotá to Bank of China through channels that American regulators cannot legally monitor. The paper trail becomes a physical trail. Yuan in, commodities out, settlement complete. For every dollar of cocaine revenue that moves through this system instead of traditional laundering, Colombian exporters capture an additional 40 to 50 cents of value. At scale, this represents a wealth transfer of $30 to $40 billion annually from the global money laundering infrastructure to the Colombian state and its allied producers. The banking implications cascade from there. South American banks hold approximately $340 billion in dollar-denominated reserves. These reserves exist because the dollar is the settlement currency of last resort, the asset that can always be exchanged for goods, services, or debt repayment anywhere in the world. But this utility depends on dollar settlement remaining the default option. When major commodity flows begin settling in non-dollar currencies, the reserve requirement shifts. Banks that hold dollars for Colombian trade settlement suddenly find themselves holding the wrong currency. The yuan they need for Chinese-Colombian bilateral trade must be acquired from somewhere, and the dollars they're holding become inventory that earns nothing, while yuan appreciates against the weakening greenback. Banco Santander's Colombia division reported $4.2 billion in dollar reserves as of Q3 2025. Bancolombia holds another $6.8 billion. Grupo Aval's combined entities show $9.1 billion. These are not abstract numbers. They represent real capital that earns real returns only if dollar-based trade continues flowing through their settlement systems. When institutions do this, they're not managing risk, they're containing disaster. On January 8, 2026, the Federal Reserve's Foreign Exchange Committee held an unscheduled session at 11:30 p.m. Eastern. No press release was issued. No minutes have been published. But 3 days later, the Treasury Department announced enhanced due diligence requirements for correspondent banking relationships with Colombian financial institutions, effective February 15th. The timing is not coincidental. Enhanced due diligence is regulatory code for prepare to cut them off. It's the same playbook Treasury used against Iranian banks in 2018, against Russian banks in 2022, and against Chinese regional banks suspected of North Korean ties in 2023. The message to South American financial institutions is explicit. Choose sides now, because neutrality will not be an option. Citibank's Latin America desk has already begun reducing Colombia exposure. Their Q4 2025 regulatory filing shows a 15% reduction in Colombian correspondent balances, from $1.2 billion to $1.02 billion, with guidance suggesting further reductions pending regulatory clarity. JP Morgan Chase's Colombia-linked credit default swaps have widened from 180 basis points to 340 basis points since November, pricing in a near-term credit event that the market sees coming even if headlines don't. Less than 45 days remain before the Treasury's enhanced due diligence requirements take effect. When they do, every South American bank must decide whether to maintain Colombian correspondent relationships and risk secondary sanctions, or sever ties and surrender market share to Chinese and Russian alternatives. There is no middle path. The last time the United States deployed financial weapons of this magnitude against a Western Hemisphere nation was Venezuela in 2019. Within 18 months, the Venezuelan banking system had collapsed. The bolivar had lost 99.9% of its value, and 5 million refugees had fled across borders. The IMF's post-mortem concluded that financial sanctions achieved their intended effect of destabilizing the target regime, while creating humanitarian consequences that exceeded initial projections by an order of magnitude. Petro is betting that Colombia is too important to sanction this aggressively. He may be wrong. While one side threatens, the other side takes possession. China's strategy in South America has never been about ideology. It's about commodities. China imports 75% of its copper from South American mines, 60% of its soybeans from South American farms, and an undisclosed but substantial percentage of its precursor chemicals for fentanyl manufacturing from South American suppliers. The cocaine trade is simply another commodity flow that China would prefer to control rather than allow American interdiction to disrupt. The People's Bank of China has extended currency swap facilities to 12 South American central banks since 2020, totaling over $50 billion in yuan liquidity. These facilities sit dormant during normal times, costing China nothing to maintain, but they represent instant access settlement capacity that can be activated the moment dollar-based systems become unavailable or uneconomical. Brazil's central bank activated its $30 billion swap line with China in March 2024 for what it called trade optimization purposes. Argentine authorities tapped their $18 billion facility in January 2025 to cover dollar debt payments when IMF disbursements were delayed. Each activation normalizes yuan settlement in a region that has processed 94% of its trade through dollar-based systems for the past 80 years. Colombia's activation of its currency swap facility would be the most significant yet, not because of size, but because of what it represents. This would be the first time a major drug-producing nation has explicitly used Chinese financial infrastructure to bypass American drug enforcement mechanisms. The precedent it sets extends far beyond cocaine. If Colombia can settle cocaine exports in yuan, Peru can settle coca paste production in yuan, Bolivia can settle lithium mining contracts in yuan, Venezuela can settle heavy crude exports in yuan without U.S. sanctions preventing payment. The entire Andean corridor, representing $180 billion in annual commodity exports, suddenly has an alternative to dollar settlement. This is not about one country choosing one currency. This is about the creation of a parallel settlement system that exists outside American legal jurisdiction. And once created, that system cannot be uncreated through diplomatic pressure alone. The mathematics of the trap are now inescapable. Petro has structured his currency gambit to be maximally difficult for the United States to oppose. The official framework involves no illegal activity. Currency swap agreements between sovereign central banks are routine instruments of international finance. The commodity codes used for test transactions are legitimate classifications that cover thousands of legal products. The bilateral settlement mechanisms simply replicate structures that China has deployed with Australia, Russia, Saudi Arabia, and dozens of other nations. The illegality is upstream, in the cultivation, processing, and trafficking of cocaine, but Petro has carefully insulated the financial mechanism from the criminal activity it ultimately serves. American prosecutors would need to prove that specific yuan transactions funded specific drug shipments, a chain of evidence that breaks down the moment money enters a foreign sovereign banking system outside U.S. subpoena power. Meanwhile, the domestic political logic is overwhelming. Colombia's annual budget runs approximately $100 billion. An additional $30 to $40 billion in captured cocaine value, even partially taxed, would allow Petro to double social spending, eliminate the fiscal deficit, and fund infrastructure programs that have languished for decades. The political constituency for this outcome is essentially the entire Colombian population below the 80th income percentile. Opposing Petro means telling 50 million Colombians that they must remain poor so that American banks can continue extracting fees from money laundering, and so that American foreign policy can maintain leverage it hasn't used constructively in 30 years. This is not a winning argument in Bogotá, and Petro knows it. The only American response that would actually stop this transition is direct military intervention, the kind that hasn't been deployed in South America since Panama in 1989. But modern Colombia is not Noriega's Panama. It's a nation of 50 million people with a professional military, difficult terrain, and the political cover of Chinese diplomatic and economic support. Invasion would be catastrophic, prolonged, and probably unsuccessful. So the United States will instead deploy financial weapons, and those weapons will fail for the same reason they failed against Russia in 2022. The target has already built an alternative settlement system. By the time sanctions reach maximum pressure, the infrastructure to bypass them will be fully operational. This is what a system looks like when every response accelerates the outcome it's trying to prevent. Dollar sanctions push Colombia toward yuan settlement. Yuan settlement creates infrastructure for other nations to follow. Other nations following reduces global dollar demand. Reduced dollar demand weakens the currency's reserve status. Weakened reserve status reduces sanction effectiveness. And reduced sanction effectiveness invites more nations to test American financial hegemony. The Federal Reserve cannot print its way out of this trap. The Treasury cannot sanction its way out. The military option is politically and practically unavailable. What remains is negotiation from weakness, accepting some version of Petro's framework in exchange for maintaining partial access to Colombian financial flows. But accepting Petro's framework legitimizes the model for every other nation watching. It proves that dollar hegemony can be challenged successfully if you structure the challenge correctly. And it invites exactly the cascade of defections that American financial strategists have warned about for a decade. There is no exit that preserves the status quo. The only question is how much value transfers from the dollar system to its alternatives, and how quickly that transfer occurs. The informed are not waiting for official announcements to understand what's happening. Central bank gold purchases hit record levels in 2024, 1,136 metric tons acquired by official institutions according to the World Gold Council. China alone reported adding 225 tons, though actual accumulation through unreported channels may be double that figure. Russia has increased gold's share of its foreign reserves from 20% to 32% since 2022. India's Reserve Bank has purchased gold in 11 consecutive months. These purchases make no sense if you believe the dollar system will continue functioning as it has. Gold pays no interest. It costs money to store. It cannot be digitally transferred. Every argument against gold as a reserve asset has been correct for the past 50 years, and central banks are buying it anyway. They're buying because they see what Colombia's gambit represents, the first serious crack in dollar settlement hegemony since Bretton Woods. They're buying because they understand that currency systems don't die slowly. They die suddenly, after a long period of stress that observers mistake for stability. They're buying because physical metal in sovereign vaults cannot be frozen, sanctioned, or deleted by a foreign power's keystroke. The premium on physical gold over paper contracts has widened to 3.2% as of January 2026, the highest sustained premium since the 2020 liquidity crisis. Dealers report 6 to 8 week delays on kilogram bars. Perth Mint, Royal Canadian Mint, and U.S. Mint production is sold out through Q2. The market for atoms is diverging from the market for digits. This divergence is not a technical anomaly. It's the physical world reasserting pricing authority over the paper abstractions that have dominated for 4 decades. Colombia's cocaine currency experiment will either succeed or fail within the next 18 months. If it succeeds, South American banking will restructure around yuan settlement, dollar reserves will become stranded assets, and American financial leverage over the Western Hemisphere will collapse to levels not seen since before World War II. If it fails, if American pressure forces Petro to abandon the project, it will only be because an even larger nation tests the model next. The question is not whether dollar hegemony faces an existential challenge. The question is, who understands that challenge well enough to position for its consequences? Physics doesn't negotiate. Mathematics doesn't care about policy preferences. And reality, eventually, asserts itself over every system that tries to deny it. The divergence between paper promises and physical possession has begun. What happens next is not prediction. It's recognition of forces already in motion.